Welcome to What the Theory with your man Joel. I'm Joel. I keep switching locations, but I only move a few centimeters from where I was. So I move like time. I move like a Ugandan going for a meeting. Anyway, today's episode is Existentialism as a humanism. This is to wrap up the existential pieces that we were doing. We started by talking about nihilism with Nietzsche. We talked about Soren Kierkegaard, but today I want to sort of wrap this up before we start the next series, Existentialism, with Existentialism is a humanism. Now this is from, well, let me explain why I've done it the way I've done it. I started with nihilism because that's the main problem. So you have Nietzsche, who says that God is dead. Not that God up in the heavens has died, but more that our belief in God is fading. God is ever receding in the minds of a culture, in the minds of even religion. Where before, when it rained, people thought, oh, God is going to get this done. Now we sort of figure out that nimbus clouds are coming up from convectional currents or whatever. Don't ask me many questions. I barely pass geography. I'm here, I'm employed. So the feeling that God has died is sort of unmooring everything. What else can we believe in? And that's where the problem of nihilism comes in. Now, Nietzsche's response to that feeling was that we have to create our own values. We have to find a way in which we move past going from God is truth to everything is false, and find a middle ground in which we say we are the ones who are going to make things powerful. We're the ones who find our values in the world. We create our own meanings. Kierkegaard, who was slightly before Nietzsche, instead talked about the fact that you might be living your life, you might be either grounded in necessity or you're grounded in possibility. Now, both of those are a problem. If you're grounded in necessity, that means you just live your life like, well, basically like a sheep. You just do everything that your culture says you're supposed to do. But inside of you, anytime you have a quiet moment, anytime you achieve anything, there is a sort of, it turns to ash in your mouth. There's a dissatisfaction with life. So you either have to keep distracting yourself by getting more and more stuff done, which becomes exhausting, or you eventually have to come to grips with your despair. And he says despair is the pathway through to the leap of faith. Eventually, when you find that achieving the things that you want to achieve, having a family, all of those things, they're nice, but in and of themselves cannot fill the hole that is inside of you. They cannot complete you. You alone can. You have to find some meaning from which all those things make sense to you, whether your job, whether your family, whether it's your place in community. Now, those discussions sort of ended up with a transcendental leap, a transcendental jump, in finding some way of substantiating our existence. Then comes along this little Frenchman, Sarte, who says, well, that's all bullshit. And his moniker is that to be an existentialist means that existence precedes essence. Now, heretofore, in all history of thought, we always thought about what's the essence of being a human being. Either you're created by God and you're given an indelible nature, you're given a purpose, and that when you find that purpose, your life will be complete. As that started to regress away, different ideas came into bearing, atheistic ideas. And those were, well, nature tells us what we are. We are animals, we are mammals, we are descended from the apes, or we are meant to fulfill our own egoistic desires, hedonistic egoism, for instance, that if God's not there to give us direction, we direct ourselves, similar to what Nietzsche says. But that's still way too optimistic, according to Sarte. The idea is that we don't even have a human nature that is fixed. Whatever we call human nature is simply contingent. It's simply the result of, I guess, adaptations that we have to our environments. But those adaptations mean that we can change. We get to choose what we're supposed to be. His point is that we have radical freedom, and that radical freedom is subjective. I have a different sort of subjective experience of reality. I have my own context in which I was born. I have my own moods. I have my own situations that I have to encounter, and no one can live that life for me. What that means is, unlike, say, this laptop's purpose, I should have said MacBook. I'm using a MacBook. I should be posing on people by saying I have a MacBook. Anyway, this MacBook's purpose is to help people like me look very cocky, or to help someone do their work. So you know, because of a manufacturer, that there's a purpose for it being in existence. And if it's used for something else, that's a misuse of its purpose. We long for that same sort of assurance. But Sartre's point of view is that you, as an existentialist realist, will realize that that's not the case for humanity. The case for us is that you simply exist, and then you try and create your own essence. Life is a project of creating yourself. You create yourself by making choices. And those choices can be made either in good faith or in bad faith. Now, his concept of bad faith was, the example he'll give is of a student who came to him and said, well, this was in the 1940s. He thought he should either go fight in the war to defend his country. He was a young Frenchman, to go defend his country, or if he should stay home and take care of his sick mother. Now, the options that he had were, if he takes care of his sick mother, no one else is going to be around for him, for her, and she needs him. She raised him, but he feels in doing that he would be neglecting his values in terms of defending the country. Perhaps maybe naively, he thought he would be one person making a difference against the invasion of the Nazis coming to take over, and his mother's life would also be in danger then. And if he went to the war, if he thought, I'm going to fight and defend, I'll be earning money, that money can go back to support my mother. In the long term, I feel like I'm defending her and sacrificing my life for her. But I won't be present for her emotionally, to be there and take care of her. And he sort of asks Sartre, as this professor, what he should do. And the only response is choose. And, thinking about that, his point in saying you have to choose is that no one can make that choice for you. You have to make that choice. And I guess by analogy, he's sort of pointing out that moral standards or moral beliefs don't hold a perfect sway. We would like to talk about the moral standards that we live by, and those make sense in an abstract, removed sort of sense. We sort of talk about them in a cliched way, but in your everyday existence, the real decisions that make us feel anguish is when those morals are in contradiction. When you have to choose between, say, lying to someone because you don't want to hurt their feelings, you don't want to be mean, or you have to choose mercy instead of justice. To follow any one of our values completely is almost impossible. So we're forever being hypocrites against our own things. And his point is that, well, that's fine. It's because there are no moral rules that are given in nature. They don't exist out there. They exist with us. And because we're ever changing and we're a project, we're always creating what it is that we want to be by making our choices. If you want to know who a person is, you look at the choices that they make. Now, the big thing I wanted to talk about on top of the making yourself as a project is Sartre sort of talks about existentialism as a humanism, as a defense against those who said that, well, it's basically nihilism. It's basically an atheistic approach. And why I started by talking about Kierkegaard is you can see, as a Christian or as a person of belief, you can be existential, and then that path leads you to a leap of faith into what you already believe. He pushes back against that by saying that if you take that leap of faith, you have to already believe in what you're doing. And the example is of Abraham. So when Abraham was told by God to sacrifice his only child, he had to believe that what was being said to him was coming from God and not from the devil and not from his own mind. So once that belief is shaken, you wouldn't even be able to hear the voice of God. And if you go through the word, very rarely is it God that is, I guess, inducing people to do things. He's not forcing people to do things. He calls. There's the voice of the Lord that calls out to you. And then, happy are those who have ears and they will hear. So to clarify the point of existentialism, he breaks it down into 3 points. And that is the 3 concepts of anguish, abandonment, and despair. Now, in anguish, you become almost a moral legislator. Every time you make a decision, the anguish that you feel, that have I made a mistake? Am I going to regret what I did? That anguish comes from the fact that you can't point to anything outside of you. You can't look at what government says. You can't look at what your society says. They might inform you, but the reason there's that tension is because you're getting mixed messages. Probably one form of authority tells you one thing, another form of authority tells you another. Inside of you, when you make that choice, it's almost like the Kantian legislator. You have to think, what would I want a person to do in this scenario? If I were to make this action, would I will that it became a law? And the anguish that you feel there is that you're trying to interrogate the choice that you're making to make sure it's not done in bad faith. To do it in bad faith would be to almost abscond the responsibility you have as a free agent to make that choice. You're sort of saying, this is my duty, or this is what a good Christian would do, or this is what a good African would do, whatever the case is. You're sort of outsourcing your identity to something else, to some amorphous movement, and that's an abandonment of your own authenticity. So anguish is the first step towards you realizing your existential nature. The next one is abandonment. So we've talked a little bit about that. It's simply the fact that in his mind, God does not exist, or at least God does not speak to us in the manner that the good books tell us, where very clearly, there's a voice booming from the sky telling you what you need to do. You feel now as though you're a child without a parent, or a parent that is silent. And so you have to sort of infer, you have to sort of figure out, well, what do I do now? There is a void that exists. You speak out and ask for an answer. You ask the universe for an answer, and nothing speaks back. Here he borrows from Dostoevsky's point in Brothers Karamazov about, if God doesn't exist, then everything is permissible. A lot of atheists have fought out against that. A lot of humanists have fought against that, saying that no, we have a human nature that pushes against it. He radically pushes by saying, well, there isn't a fixed human nature for us to blame our mistakes on. We have to accept that we are responsible for all our choices, because internally, either we're responsible or we're not. And since we hold each other responsible for the actions that we take, and we hold ourselves responsible, we intuitively understand that we are the choices that we are making. We are free individuals. The basis of all of our friendships, love, communion, all of that is based on someone who is free, making a choice to give us their freedom. So if we remove that fact that we are free and say, well, we have to do things because of our duty, we have a moral obligation, we are in contradiction to the fact that we're actually abandoned. We don't have any outside source that we can peg our actions to. It's very nihilistic, actually. The last bit is, if you think about signs from the Lord, if you're interpreting a sign, the point there is, it's not so much what the sign is, it's how your interpretation comes to bear. The same thing could be seen by someone who is irreligious or someone who is religious, and it would be a different thing. David Foster Wallace talks about a story of a man who was stuck in a blizzard, and he was praying. This is an irreligious man who was praying that he could get some support and some aid and help before he freezes to death. Just on the brink of him passing out, some Eskimos show up. It's an Inuit tribe, and they are able to rescue him, and he comes back to camp. Telling this story to a religious man, he says, well, that was God answering your prayer. And to the irreligious man, he says, no, all that happened is that those guys were walking by and they saw me. So they're different interpretations of the same thing. One is very sure that that was God's intervention in humanity. Another is, this is merely coincidence. So the truly, we are all responsible for our own interpretation. Even if you're a person of faith, you have made that choice, and no one else can make that for you. Then lastly, you go from anguish to the realization of abandonment to now despair. Now despair is the understanding that whatever we try and drown ourselves in, whatever we try to distract ourselves from, is an illusion. It's almost like you become aware of how separate you are, that your subjectiveness is something that no one else will understand but you. Other subjective beings have their own experiences. You can commiserate on those, but outside of that, only you have that choice to make. Let me read this for you. It says, I must confine myself to what I can see. I must make my choices, and in my making my choices, I am making who I am. I cannot count on men whom I do not know based on faith in the goodness of humanity or in man's interest in society's welfare. Reality alone exists. So these attitudes, it's a deeply optimistic doctrine that he argues. And he argues that as a humanism because he says that the response to what he's saying is there is no morality in the world. There is no basis by which you can make these choices. And we are afraid that we will then degrade ourselves, that we will tear ourselves apart, that men will choose evil. And he comes back by saying, well, that means that at base, you need those beliefs and you're not exactly looking for the truth, because we assume that the truth is going to be something that we would want. He's saying that what if the truth is actually bare and terrible, and the fact that life begins in tears, with a mother crying for a child coming to this world. There's a brief moment of some joy. You live maybe 70 years. In that, you also suffer a lot of blows. You have a lot of pain, and it probably ends in you weeping. And there is an infinite amount of time before that and an infinite amount of time after that. Would you look at that existence and say that it's here for us to be happy? Probably not. But we still get to choose what we do with our time. And he says we should believe in the human ability to make the choices that would allow for flourishing. My own point of view is, I think, he probably goes too far on the idea of individualism and the idea of humanism coming out of individual responsibility only. I think we are not just even when you think of yourself as an individual, all the things that define you as an individual consist in your relations with others. So probably it makes more sense for us to look at each other as human beings, as people who are in this joint endeavor, trying to figure this shit out. One of his plays is called No Exit, and in that, that's where the saying "hell is other people" comes from. It's just these three people who die and they find that they've gone into hell, and there are no torture devices. There's nothing like fire. It's just three people in a room, and there's no way of getting out of that room. There are no mirrors, there's no exit. It's just one room with three people. There is no privacy, and forever you're being looked at. And his point there is that when you're being looked at is when you have a sudden understanding of yourself, not only as a subjective being, but as an object of someone else's subjective experience. And in that feeling, he says that the nature of interaction between human beings is always going to be of conflict. There will forever be conflict, whether you love someone, whether you hate someone, whether they're your fellow gender, if they're in your race, if they're in your country, whatever the case may be, if anytime there's another conscious being, because that being has an immediate subjective experience of reality, and they have to fit you into that subjective experience, those two things can never tally. There's almost a master-slave dynamic, and you find ways in which you have to either manipulate each other, coerce each other, convince each other to go along with their own narratives. But we are each trying to fix the world into the narratives that we have. Ultimately, that means that we have the responsibility for the worldview that we have. It might rhyme with someone else's, it might be in concert with someone else's, but we have to take that responsibility ourselves. We exist first with no purpose, and then the choices that we make us who we are. And that is existentialism as a humanism, according to Jean-Paul Sartre. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.